There's something you need to realize. Someone didn't just fall for you. They lost control in a way they don't even understand. What they feel isn't simple, and it isn't safe, because it was never really about you in the first place. You touched something buried deep inside them, something they spent years trying to ignore, and now that it's awake, it's changing everything, for them, and maybe for you too. There is someone out there who feels an intense, almost overwhelming love for you, and the reason behind it might feel more unsettling than flattering, because it isn't really about who you think you are. It's about something in them that you unknowingly brought to the surface. And once you become aware of it, it's not something you can simply ignore. You might believe love comes from attraction, shared beliefs, or perfect timing. That idea feels safe, easy to accept, but comfort can be deceptive. The truth is, the kind of love that feels deep, consuming, even irrational doesn't begin in logic. It forms in the unconscious. Without realizing it, you stepped into a hidden part of their inner world, something they had kept buried for a long time. You didn't just make them feel good, you made them feel truly seen. And that kind of recognition can be frightening, because when someone feels understood at that depth, it goes far beyond simple admiration. It creates a powerful attachment, something intense and difficult to control. Most people misunderstand this. They think being loved is the same as being liked, but what's happening here is far more complex. You didn't just attract them, you triggered something within them, something suppressed, something they avoided confronting, and somehow you became the mirror reflecting it back to them, not because you tried, but simply because of who you were, unexpected, undefined, and beyond their control. That's what disrupted them. Their mind was built to protect them, to keep certain feelings hidden, certain desires buried. But when you appeared, those defenses started to break down, and what they feel for you isn't simple or pure. It's layered, part longing, part fear, part projection, and something that comes very close to obsession. You didn't just catch their attention, you unsettled them, and when the unconscious is shaken, it often feels like fate. What makes it even more powerful is that you didn't do anything obvious. You didn't follow a pattern or say the perfect words. In fact, you broke their expectations, and the human mind depends on patterns. So when something meaningful feels unpredictable, it leaves a deep impression. You became that rare kind of unpredictability, not chaotic but symbolic, as if you stood for something bigger than yourself. That's when they stopped seeing you clearly. You became more than a person. You became an answer to a question they didn't even know they were asking, a solution to an emptiness they couldn't explain. And once that happens, they don't just fall in love with you, they fall into you. Letting go becomes incredibly difficult because it would mean facing the part of themselves you awakened. And that's something the mind resists with everything it has. So they hold on, even when it confuses them, even when it hurts, even when it doesn't make sense. But here's the part that can be unsettling. You didn't just awaken something beautiful, you also stirred something unstable. Because when suppressed emotions come to the surface, they don't arrive gently. They come out intensely. They can distort perception, blur boundaries, and create feelings that seem real but aren't always grounded. And you can feel it, can't you? That unusual intensity in the way they look at you, the tension in how they respond, that sense that something deeper is happening even in silence. The truth is, they don't fully understand it either. This isn't happening at a conscious level. It's unfolding beneath it, in a place where logic doesn't operate, where contradictions can exist at the same time, where love and fear become almost impossible to separate. That's why their behavior feels inconsistent. One moment they're drawn to you, completely present. The next, they pull away. Not because their feelings disappeared, but because their defenses kicked in. Something inside them warns that this connection is risky, that it's exposing something they're not ready to face. So a pattern forms, an unconscious push and pull, desire followed by fear, closeness followed by distance, intensity followed by confusion. And whether you realize it or not, you're part of that dynamic too, because on some level, you feel it, that this connection is different, heavier, more intense, like it's pulling something out of you as well. And that's where the real question begins. What exactly did you awaken in them that made this so powerful? Because it wasn't random, it wasn't luck, and it definitely wasn't an accident. There was a moment, one exact moment, when something inside them shifted. Something recognized you on a level they couldn't explain. And once that recognition happened, there was no going back. But here's what most people never truly understand. That recognition had nothing to do with who you appear to be on the surface. It was about what you represent deep within their unconscious. And what you represent is something they've been searching for, avoiding, and needing all at once. Until you understand that, you'll never fully grasp why they can't let go, or why this connection feels so intense, so confusing, and so difficult to explain. Because the truth is, you didn't just make them fall in love. You activated something in them that had been buried for years. And once something like that wakes up, it doesn't simply disappear. It lingers, it grows, it demands attention, and eventually, it forces them to face it. The real question is, when that moment comes, will they confront it, or will they lose themselves trying to run from it? At first, they tried to convince themselves it was nothing, just a passing feeling, a temporary fascination that would fade with time. But time didn't weaken it, it only made it stronger, because what they're feeling isn't based on surface attraction. It comes from something much deeper, something older, something hidden in the unconscious. The unconscious doesn't forget. It waits, quietly, patiently. It gathers every unresolved emotion, every unfulfilled desire, and holds on to it until something brings it back to life. And somehow, that something became you. But the truth is, you didn't enter their life as just another person. You entered as a trigger, a key, a symbol that unlocked emotions they spent years trying not to feel. And that's where it becomes dangerous. Because once the unconscious is activated, it doesn't ask for permission. It takes over in subtle ways, quietly shaping thoughts and feelings. Most people think obsession is obvious, constant messages, desperate behavior, visible intensity, but real obsession often hides. It stays behind silence, behind control, behind distance. Because the deeper the feeling, the more the mind tries to suppress it. And the more it's suppressed, the stronger it becomes. So they start analyzing you, overthinking every small detail, replaying conversations over and over like a loop they can't switch off. Not because they want to, but because they can't stop. You've become tied to something unresolved within them, something incomplete. And unfinished emotional patterns are some of the strongest forces driving human behavior. But here's what you might not fully realize. The intensity you feel from them isn't just about you. It's about what you symbolize. In the language of the unconscious, people don't fall in love with individuals. They fall in love with meanings. And you became the meaning of something they lost, something they never had, or something they believed they didn't deserve. That's why this feels so overwhelming for them. Loving you forces them to face a contradiction inside themselves. One part of them wants to move closer to you, to hold on, but another part resists just as strongly. Not because they don't care, but because caring exposes everything they've been avoiding. And that inner conflict doesn't stay hidden. It shows up in hesitation, in mixed signals, in moments where they feel close and then suddenly distant. You can feel it. The shift, the inconsistency, the sense that something is pulling them toward you while something else is pulling them away. But the truth is, they're not confused about you. They're overwhelmed by themselves. You've awakened a part of them that doesn't follow logic, a part driven by emotion, memory, and suppressed desire, a part that remembers things they thought were long forgotten. And once that part is awake, it starts asking questions they can't easily answer. Why does this feel so familiar? Why does it scare them so much? Why are they drawn to it but also desperate to escape it? This is where the mind begins to split, not in an obvious way, but internally, quietly. The conscious mind wants stability, safety, control, but the unconscious wants resolution, and real resolution often requires disruption. So what do? They create distance, not because they want to lose you, but because they're trying to regain control over themselves. They tell themselves that space will calm things down, that time will bring clarity, that distance will weaken the feeling. But it doesn't. Distance doesn't reduce unconscious attachment, it intensifies it. Because when you're not physically present, reality fades and imagination takes over. And imagination is where obsession grows the strongest. You stop being just a real person in their life. You become an idea, a mental image, a projection shaped by everything they can't fully understand. And projections don't have limits. They expand, they evolve, they become more perfect, more meaningful, more necessary over time. That's why it becomes so hard for them to break free. Because they're no longer attached to who you truly are. They're attached to what you've become in their mind, and that version of you feels irreplaceable. What makes it even more intense is that they don't fully trust it. They don't trust how strong it feels, how fast it grew, how deeply it affects them. Because anything that powerful must come with a cost, and their mind senses that. So it creates doubt, fear, resistance, not to destroy the feeling, but to protect them from what it might demand. Because if they fully accept what they feel for you, they would have to face everything they've been avoiding, every hidden desire, every unresolved pain, every truth they buried. And that's not something the mind allows easily. So they stay stuck in between, pulled in opposite directions, wanting you, but resisting you, thinking about you constantly, but avoiding you at the same time, feeling everything deeply, yet expressing almost nothing. And that tension doesn't just disappear, it builds, slowly, quietly, until it reaches a point where something has to give. But here's the question that should stay with you. What happens when that tension becomes too much to hold? Because eventually it will. The human mind can't carry that level of conflict forever. At some point, it breaks. And when it does, it doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes it leads to a confession. Sometimes it leads to complete withdrawal. And sometimes it leads to actions that seem irrational, even self-destructive. Because when the unconscious takes over, logic steps aside and emotion takes control. And then comes the moment where everything inside them shifts for good. The point where they can no longer convince themselves this is just a passing phase. The point where they are forced to face what this truly is. And you need to understand something. This moment is coming whether they feel ready for it or not. Because what you stirred in them isn't temporary. It isn't shallow. It isn't something they can push aside forever. It's something that demands to be resolved. And resolution always asks for a price. The real question is what they're willing to lose just to avoid facing what they feel for you. At some point, the mind stops bargaining. There's a limit to suppression, and they've already crossed it. You can feel it in the silence between you, the kind that feels heavy, almost suffocating. It doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting, because what's happening inside them is no longer stable. It's building pressure. And pressure in the mind always looks for a way out, but release doesn't always come in the form of clarity. Sometimes it shows up as a collapse, and that's when it becomes almost too much for them to handle. Because now it's not just curiosity or attraction anymore, it's confrontation. They are being forced to face parts of themselves they spent years avoiding. Old wounds, old rejections, deep beliefs that told them they were either not enough or too much, that loving or being loved was never safe. And then you came into their life without trying and challenged all of it. But the mind doesn't accept contradictions easily. It resists them. It tries to reshape them into something safer, because accepting you would mean rewriting everything they've believed about themselves. And that kind of change isn't gentle. It's intense, deeply uncomfortable. So instead of fully accepting it, they split around it. One part of them moves closer to you, craving the connection, craving the intensity, craving the feeling of finally being seen. But another part pulls back just as strongly, sending signals they don't fully understand, warning them that this isn't safe, that it might hurt, that it could expose them. And this is where it gets darker, because the closer they feel to you, the more exposed they feel within themselves. And that kind of exposure doesn't just feel emotional, it feels like a threat to who they are, because you're not just someone they like. You've become something that challenges the identity they built to survive. And identities built for survival don't just disappear, they fight back, sometimes quickly, sometimes in ways that seem confusing or even destructive. So they start creating explanations to make sense of it. They tell themselves maybe it's temporary, maybe it's not real, maybe they're just overthinking everything. But the truth is, they're not trying to understand it, they're trying to contain it. Because truly understanding it would mean admitting something they're not ready to face. That what they feel for you is real and deeper than anything they've known before. And that's where the tension becomes unbearable. Because no matter how much they try to explain it away, their body doesn't agree, their deeper mind doesn't listen. That pull toward you doesn't fade, it grows, quietly, steadily, like something inside them is insisting that this matters, that it cannot be ignored, and ignoring it starts to cost them. Emotionally, mentally, even physically. Because feelings that aren't expressed don't just vanish, they change form. They turn into restlessness, anxiety, a constant sense that something is missing, even when everything else seems fine. And somehow, you become the center of that feeling. Not because they chose it, but because their mind has connected you to something essential, something they can't replace. This is when things begin to crack. Small moments at first, times where their control slips, where they almost say something, almost reveal how deep this really goes. But then they pull back harder than before, because now they're not just afraid of the feeling, they're afraid of themselves, afraid of how intense it is, afraid of how little control they actually have. And this creates a cycle that becomes more unstable over time. The closer they get, the more they panic. The more they pull away, the stronger the feeling becomes. Eventually, this cycle starts to break them, not outwardly, because on the surface they still seem composed, but inside there's chaos. Because you've created a conflict they can't resolve. They want you, but wanting you feels dangerous. They feel connected to you, but connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly what they've been protecting themselves from. So now they're stuck, between desire and fear, between truth and denial, between moving closer and running away. And what most people never realize is this isn't just emotional tension. It's something deeper. It's a conflict at the level of identity. Because moving toward you means becoming someone different, someone more open, more exposed, more honest. And that version of themselves feels unfamiliar, unstable, even threatening. But moving away doesn't free them either. They carry the feeling with them. It follows them quietly, turning into regret, into longing, into that persistent question, what if they walked away from something real? And that question starts to break them, because now there's no easy choice. Only two difficult paths: face what they feel or spend their life trying to forget it. And forgetting isn't as simple as they hoped, because you're no longer just a memory. You've become part of their inner world, a symbol, a trigger, something that keeps returning in dreams, in quiet moments, in thoughts they can't control. And this is where the pressure reaches its peak. The mind can only hold so much conflict before it demands release. And when that release comes, it's not always gentle. Sometimes it comes as a breaking point, a moment where everything they've been holding inside spills out, unfiltered, uncontrollable, impossible to hide. And right before that moment, there's always a kind of silence. Not peaceful, but heavy, like something inside them has stopped pretending. That's when the truth rises, clear, unprotected, impossible to deny. Because at that point, they've already tried everything: distance, distraction, denial. But reality doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable, and what they feel for you has become undeniable. And then comes the realization that changes everything. This was never about controlling their feelings. It was about facing what those feelings reveal. And what they reveal shakes them deeply. Because you didn't just make them fall in love, you exposed the part of them that has been starving for something real, for connection, for validation, for truth. And now the illusion falls apart. They can't hide behind logic anymore. They can't pretend it's just attraction. They can't avoid the question that keeps following them. Why you? Why does this feel so familiar? Why does it feel like something they've been waiting for without even knowing it? The answer isn't simple. It's tied to something unfinished in their past, something buried so deeply they almost forgot it existed. But the unconscious never forgets. It waits for something to reflect it back, and somehow, that reflection became you. But here's what affects them the most. You didn't just reflect who they are. You showed them who they could have been. And that realization cuts deeper than anything else. Because now, loving you isn't just about loving you. It's about grieving a version of themselves they never allowed to exist. A version that was open, fearless, and ready for something real. And that makes everything heavier, because every moment they avoid you feels like betraying that version, and every step toward you feels like stepping into something unknown, something they can't control. So now they understand. There's no safe path, no middle ground, no way to feel this deeply without being changed by it. They're left with a choice that doesn't feel like a choice at all. If they walk away, they lose you. But more than that, they lose the chance to become the person they glimpsed through you. And that loss doesn't fade. It lingers, turning into regret that can resurface years later. But if they move toward you, they lose control. They lose the identity that once protected them. They lose the illusion that they can avoid vulnerability. And for the mind, losing control can feel like losing everything. This is the breaking point. The moment where every defense fails, where every excuse falls apart, where the truth stands on its own. They are not just in love with you, they are being changed by you. And change is never gentle. It breaks before it rebuilds. It strips away illusions before revealing truth. It forces confrontation before allowing real connection. That's why this feels so intense, so overwhelming, so impossible to ignore. Because it was never meant to be simple. It was meant to transform them. And here is the final truth they can't escape. They didn't choose to feel this way, but they will choose what they do with it. And that choice will shape who they become, not just now, but in every moment after. Because people don't remember the feelings they avoided. They remember the ones that changed them. And you are not just a passing feeling in their life. You are a turning point, a shift, a doorway into something they've been avoiding for years. And now that door is open, it won't fully close. There is no going back to who they were before, only forward or away. Both paths come with a cost, but only one leads to something real. And deep down, they already know it. What you're describing feels powerful, but it's easy to drift into a story that gives you too much responsibility for someone else's inner world. People can feel intense attraction or attachment, sometimes quickly and sometimes in confusing ways, but it's rarely because one person has awakened something uncontrollable in the other. A lot of what feels like deep, almost fated connection is actually a mix of psychology, projection, unmet emotional needs, past experiences, and how someone has learned to relate to closeness. When someone seems drawn in and then suddenly distant, it can come from internal conflict, but not always in a dramatic or unconscious awakening sense. It's often simpler and more grounded. They might like you but feel unsure, they might fear commitment, or they may not be ready for the kind of connection they sense. The push-pull dynamic you described is real, but it's commonly linked to things like attachment styles. Some people crave closeness, but also fear it. So they move toward you and then back away when it starts to feel too real. The idea that someone is obsessed in silence or constantly thinking about you can feel flattering, but it can also be misleading. People have complex lives and inner processes, and while someone might think about you a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean they're overwhelmed or transformed. Sometimes it just means they're interested but unsure how to act, or they're weighing their options, or even dealing with unrelated stress. What matters more than trying to decode their unconscious is what actually shows up in their behavior. Do they communicate clearly, show consistency, and make an effort to be present? Or is it mostly mixed signals, distance, and ambiguity? Real connection isn't just intensity, it's stability, mutual effort, and clarity over time. There's also a risk in believing that you're the trigger or the key to someone else's transformation. That kind of narrative can create pressure and blur boundaries. You're not responsible for fixing, awakening, or completing anyone. If someone is struggling with their own emotions or past, that's something they have to face and work through themselves. At the same time, these kinds of intense connections can feel meaningful because they do highlight something real, how strongly humans can respond to emotional resonance. When you meet someone who reflects parts of you or who sees you in a way that feels rare, it can feel almost surreal. But even then, it's important to stay grounded in reality rather than getting lost in the idea of destiny or uncontrollable forces. If you're in a situation like this, it helps to focus less on what they might be feeling deep inside and more on what's actually happening between you. Are you being treated with respect? Are things moving forward in a healthy way? Are your own needs being met? Intensity without clarity can feel powerful, but it often leads to confusion rather than something lasting. This was never just about love, it was about transformation. You didn't simply enter their life, you forced them to face a truth they had been running from for years. Now they stand at a crossroads where avoiding it means losing something real, and embracing it means becoming someone new. Either way, they won't leave this unchanged, because some connections aren't meant to comfort you, they're meant to awaken you.